how many people died in World War II. The number is so big it's hard to grasp. Around 75 million, that includes about 20 million soldiers and a staggering 55 million civilians. Imagine the entire population of California and Texas today, just gone. The war lasted 2,194 days. Do the math. That's an average of over 34,000 people dying every single day. For 6 years. How much did it all cost? In today's money, it's estimated to be over $15 trillion. That's a number with 12 zeros after it. A figure so large it loses all meaning. But behind these giant impersonal numbers are millions of individual stories. Stories of production, of sacrifice, of survival, and of death. What was the single deadliest battle? How did one country manage to produce more tanks than its enemy, even after being invaded? What was the real price of victory for the countries that won? The statistics of this war don't just tell a story of armies and battles. They reveal the sheer scale of human effort, suffering, and destruction. They pull back the curtain on what happens when the entire world goes to war. The numbers are not just numbers. They are echoes of lives lived and lost. Number 22. How many Americans were drafted? The United States entered the war late. The fighting had been raging for over 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But once committed, the country mobilized on a scale it had never seen before or since. The core of this mobilization was the draft. The number is 10,110,104. Over 10 million men were inducted into the armed forces through the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This was the first peacetime draft in American history, a controversial measure signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt more than a year before the U.S. officially entered the conflict. He and his advisors saw the storm clouds gathering in Europe and Asia, and knew that if war came, America could not be unprepared. When the draft began, the pool of eligible men was massive. It initially included all men between the ages of 21 and 36. After the U.S. entered the war, this was expanded to include men from 18 to 45. In total, over 50 million men registered. From this massive pool, about 36 million were classified as available for service. The draft boards, local bodies made up of civilians, had the difficult job of deciding who would go and who would stay. They weighed factors like occupation, dependency, and physical fitness. A farmer might be deferred because his work was essential to the food supply. A factory worker building airplanes might be deemed more valuable at home. The draft changed the face of America. It pulled men from every walk of life. Farm boys from Kansas found themselves on ships in the Pacific, and accountants from New York learned to operate tanks in the deserts of North Africa. The military swelled from a small professional force of around 334,000 in 1939 to over 16 million men and women in uniform by 1945. About two-thirds of those who served were draftees, the other third were volunteers. This immense mobilization came at a cost. Over 400,000 American service members died in the war. The draft meant that nearly every family, every community had a direct connection to the fighting. The blue star in a window meant a family member was serving. A gold star meant they were not coming home. The system wasn't perfect. There were inconsistencies between local draft boards and accusations of favoritism. But it achieved its goal. It raised the massive army needed to fight a global war on two fronts, an ocean apart. We have detailed records of how many were drafted, but what was the true psychological impact on that generation of men, many of whom were barely out of their teens? How many cases of what we now call PTSD went undiagnosed and untreated for the rest of their lives? And what was the real economic cost to the small towns that lost so many of their young men? A loss of labor and potential that could never be fully measured. Number 21. How many people were forcibly moved? The end of the war in 1945 did not mean peace for everyone. For tens of millions of people, it was the beginning of a new kind of suffering. The fighting had redrawn borders, destroyed homes, and unleashed waves of ethnic and political cleansing. The number of people uprooted from their homes is one of the most staggering and least understood statistics of the war. At least 40 million people were displaced in Europe alone. This term, displaced persons, or DPs, became common language in the post-war years. It was a sterile phrase for a human catastrophe. This number includes people who are forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, and ethnic Germans expelled from territories in Eastern Europe. They were people without a country, without a home, wandering a continent in ruins. The largest single movement of people was the expulsion of ethnic Germans. As the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east, and with the later agreement of the Allied leaders at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, between 12 and 14 million German-speaking civilians were forced from their homes in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Many of these families had lived in these regions for centuries. They were given little notice, forced to abandon their property, and began a desperate trek west into what was left of Germany. The journey was brutal. It is estimated that between 500,000 and 2 million of them died from starvation, disease, or violence along the way. But they were not the only ones. Millions of Poles were shifted westward as the Soviet Union annexed the eastern part of their country. Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians were also forcibly moved or fled the Soviet takeover of their lands. In the aftermath of the fighting, Allied armies found themselves responsible for millions of DPs. They set up massive camps trying to provide food, shelter, and medical care. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration (UNRWA) was created in 1943 specifically to deal with this crisis. For years after the surrender, the primary work in Europe was not just rebuilding cities, but trying to sort out this human chaos, to repatriate people who had homes to return to, and to find new homes for those who did not. This was particularly true for the hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the German extermination camps, who often had no families or communities left. The scale of this displacement is hard to comprehend. It was the largest forced migration in human history. It fundamentally changed the ethnic map of Europe. The war didn't just destroy buildings, it tore apart the very fabric of societies, scattering millions of people to the winds. The official numbers are vast, but how many people simply vanished during these chaotic post-war migrations, their fates never recorded? What was the long-term genetic and cultural impact on regions that were completely emptied of one population and repopulated by another? And how many of the stories of the individual families caught in this massive ethnic unmixing have been permanently lost to history? Number 20, how much bomb tonnage was dropped? The air war was a defining feature of the conflict. It brought the front line to cities and towns far from any battlefield. The goal was not just to hit military targets, but to destroy the enemy's industrial capacity and, in the words of some planners, their will to fight. The amount of explosives dropped from the sky is a testament to this strategy. Allied forces dropped approximately 2.7 million tons of bombs in the European theater alone. To put that in perspective, that's the weight of more than 400,000 adult male elephants. The U.S. Army Air Forces dropped about 1.5 million tons, and the British Royal Air Force dropped about 1.2 million tons. This campaign of strategic bombing escalated throughout the war. In the early years, raids were smaller and less accurate. A single raid by the American 8th Air Force could involve over 1,000 heavy bombers, each carrying several tons of bombs. The campaign against Germany was relentless. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden were subjected to firebombing raids that created immense firestorms, sucking the oxygen out of the air and incinerating everything in their path. The raid on Hamburg in July 1943, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, killed an estimated 42,000 civilians. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 remains one of the most controversial acts of the war, killing around 25,000 people in a city with questionable military significance at that stage of the conflict. The idea, championed by figures like RAF, Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, was that dehousing the German industrial workforce would cripple production. In the Pacific, the bombing was just as intense, but it came later. The development of the B-29 Superfortress, a long-range heavy bomber, allowed the U.S. to strike the Japanese home islands from bases in the Mariana Islands. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the U.S. bomber forces, shifted tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-level nighttime raids with incendiary bombs. The results were devastating. Japanese cities, largely built of wood and paper, were incredibly vulnerable to fire. The single most destructive air raid in history was not Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945. In that one raid, around 300 B-29s dropped 1,700 tons of incendiaries, burning 16 square miles of the city to the ground and killing an estimated 100,000 people, injuring many more. The strategic bombing campaigns were enormously costly for the Allies as well. The 8th Air Force, flying daylight raids over Germany, suffered staggering casualties. They lost more men killed in action than the entire U.S. Marine Corps. The life of a bomber crew member was statistically grim. The odds were against them completing their full tour of missions. We know the tonnage dropped and have estimates of the dead, but what was the true effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign? Did it actually shorten the war, as its proponents claimed, or did it stiffen civilian resolve? How many unexploded bombs from that era still lie hidden beneath European and Japanese cities today? And how did the moral calculus of targeting civilian centers in the 1940s shape the doctrines of warfare for the rest of the 20th century? And number 19, what was the war's single deadliest day? Pinpointing the single deadliest day in a conflict that spanned 6 years and the entire globe is difficult. Battles raged for weeks, and death tolls were often compiled long after the fighting stopped. However, if we look for a single 24-hour period with a clear and catastrophic loss of life, one event stands out, an event that ushered in a new age of warfare. August 6th, 1945. This was the day the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. In an instant, the world changed. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was detonated about 1,900 feet above the city center. It exploded with the force of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The immediate result was a flash of light and heat so intense that it vaporized people closest to the blast and created a massive fireball with temperatures reaching millions of degrees Celsius. The immediate death toll is estimated to be between 70,000 and 80,000 people. These were individuals who died within seconds or minutes from the blast, the heat, or the collapsing buildings. But the dying didn't stop there. The bomb unleashed a wave of radiation, a silent killer that would claim tens of thousands more lives in the weeks, months, and years that followed. People who seemed to have survived the initial blast would later succumb to radiation sickness, a horrific illness that destroyed their bodies from the inside out. The city of Hiroshima was obliterated. Nearly 70% of its buildings were destroyed. The blast created a shockwave that flattened everything within a radius of about a mile. Fires broke out across the city, merging into a giant firestorm that consumed what little was left. The day itself was one of chaos and unimaginable suffering. Survivors, terribly burned and injured, wandered through the ruins in a daze. Medical facilities were destroyed, and most of the city's doctors and nurses were killed or injured, leaving the wounded with little to no care. While other days in the war saw horrific casualties spread across vast fronts, like during the opening of Operation Barbarossa or the Battle of Stalingrad, the concentration of death in a single city in a single moment on August 6th is unparalleled. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people instantly. These two events forced Japan's surrender and brought the war to an end, but they did so at a terrible human cost and left a legacy of nuclear fear that would hang over the world for the rest of the century. We have scientific estimates of the immediate death toll, but what is the true number of hibakusha, the survivors, who died prematurely from radiation-induced cancers and other illnesses in the decades that followed? How did the decision-makers like President Harry Truman truly weigh the morality of using such a weapon against the projected casualties of a full-scale invasion of Japan? And what classified documents about the long-term health effects observed in the survivors might still exist in US and Japanese archives, yet to be released? Number 18, how many U-boats did Germany build? The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the war, running from 1939 to 1945. At its heart was the German U-boat, the undersea boot. These submarines were the primary weapon in the German Navy's attempt to sever the lifeline of supplies from North America to Great Britain. The success of this campaign hinged on one thing building enough: U-boats to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. Germany built 1,156 U-boats during the war. This number represents a massive industrial effort. The man in charge of the U-boat arm was Admiral Karl Donitz. He believed that with enough submarines, he could starve Britain into submission. In the early years of the war, his strategy was devastatingly effective. The U-boats, often hunting in groups called wolf packs, sank millions of tons of Allied shipping. The period from mid-1940 to the end of 1942 was known to the U-boat crews as the Happy Time. The workhorse of the U-boat fleet was the Type 7, a relatively small but effective submarine. Over 700 of them were built. But the industrial production, while impressive, was only half the story. The other half was the human cost for the men who served on them. Life aboard a U-boat was cramped, foul, and terrifying. The crews lived in a steel tube packed with machinery, torpedoes, and unwashed bodies under constant threat of a violent death. The tide of the battle turned in 1943. The Allies developed better technology and tactics. They cracked the German naval Enigma codes, allowing them to reroute convoys away from the wolf packs. They developed long-range patrol aircraft like the B-24 Liberator that could hunt U-boats in the mid-Atlantic air gap where they had previously been safe. Those new weapons like radar, sonar ASDIC, and the Hedgehog forward-throwing depth charge made U-boats much more vulnerable. The loss rate for U-boat crews was the highest of any branch of service in any country's military. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served on U-boats, around 30,000 of them never returned. That is a 75% casualty rate. Out of the 1,156 U-boats built, 783 were lost to enemy action. By the end of the war, to be assigned to a U-boat was practically a death sentence. The hunters had become the hunted. We know how many U-boats were built and lost, but how many Allied sailors' deaths can be directly attributed to the early successes of the wolf packs, a number that is often lost in the broader statistics of the war at sea. What was the true extent of the psychological breakdown among the U-boat crews as the casualty rate soared past 50%? And how many undiscovered U-boat wrecks, potential time capsules from the war, still lie on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean? Number 17, how much did the war cost in today's money? The wars are fought with more than just soldiers and weapons. They are fought with money, industry, and resources. The financial cost of World War II was, like its human cost, on a scale that had never been seen before. It bankrupted nations, reshaped the global economy, and laid the foundation for the post-war world. The estimated total cost of the war is over $1.5 trillion in 1945 US dollars. When adjusted for inflation, that number becomes almost impossible to pin down precisely, but most economic historians place it somewhere between $15 and $20 trillion in today's money. This figure includes direct military spending, but it doesn't even begin to cover the cost of property damage, lost economic productivity, or the long-term costs of veteran care and war debts. The United States was the financial powerhouse of the Allied war effort. It spent an estimated $341 billion in 1945 dollars, which is over $5 trillion today. This spending pulled the country out of the Great Depression and transformed it into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. A significant portion of this money went to the Lend-Lease program, a policy enacted in March 1941 that allowed the U.S. to supply war materials to Allied nations. The U.S. supplied over $50 billion in aid, $700 billion today, to more than 30 countries, with the bulk going to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. This program was crucial. It kept Britain in the fight and provided the Soviets with vital supplies, especially trucks, trains, and communications equipment, that helped them defeat the German army on the Eastern Front. For other nations, the cost was crippling. The United Kingdom spent over $120 billion and was effectively bankrupt by the end of the war. It had sold off its overseas assets and had taken on massive debts, much of it to the United States. It would take decades for the British economy to recover. The Soviet Union's cost is harder to calculate because of its state-controlled economy, but the physical destruction was immense. The German invasion destroyed over 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages. The economic damage was catastrophic. Germany and Japan also spent fortunes on their war efforts, and in the end had nothing to show for it but ruined cities and occupied territories. The money to pay for all this came from taxes, war bonds, and printing money, which led to inflation. In the U.S., citizens were urged to buy war bonds to support the troops. The tax system was overhauled, and income tax was expanded to cover a majority of the population for the first time. The war fundamentally altered the relationship between government and the economy in nearly every country it touched. The estimates are based on official government spending. But what was the true cost when you factor in black markets, looted assets, and the destruction of unquantifiable cultural treasures? How would the global balance of power have shifted if the U.S. had demanded full repayment of the Lend-Lease debts from its allies? And what is the hidden long-term economic cost of the generations of innovation and entrepreneurship that were lost on the battlefields? Number 16, what was the death toll in the war against Japan in China? When people in the West think of World War II, they often focus on the European theater or the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. but one of the largest and longest struggles of the entire conflict took place in China. The Second Sino-Japanese War officially began in 1937, 2 years before the invasion of Poland, and it was a theater of unimaginable brutality and scale. The number of Chinese casualties is one of the most shocking statistics of the entire war. It is estimated that between 15 and 20 million Chinese people died during the conflict. The vast majority of these, perhaps as many as 80%, were civilians. This means that China suffered the second highest death toll of any nation, surpassed only by the Soviet Union. The war in China was not a war of fast-moving tank columns and aerial dogfights in the same way as the European War. It was often a grinding, brutal war of attrition. The Japanese Imperial Army occupied vast swaths of eastern China, including most of the major cities and industrial centers. Their occupation was marked by extreme violence against the civilian population. Events like the rape of Nanking in 1937, where Japanese soldiers murdered an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers in a matter of weeks, were not isolated incidents. The Japanese military employed a three-alls policy in many areas: kill all, burn all, loot all. This was a strategy of collective punishment designed to terrorize the population and destroy support for the Chinese resistance. Millions of Chinese died from direct violence, but millions more died from the secondary effects of the war, starvation, and disease. The Japanese army often confiscated food supplies, leading to widespread famine. The deliberate breaking of the Yellow River dikes by the Chinese nationalist government in 1938, an attempt to halt the Japanese advance, ended up drowning hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and displacing millions more, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. The Chinese resistance, split between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong, fought on for 8 long years. Despite being poorly equipped and often divided, they managed to tie down over 1 million Japanese soldiers, preventing Japan from deploying those troops elsewhere in the Pacific. The contribution of China to the Allied victory is often understated. They absorbed the bulk of the Japanese army's strength and suffered for it immensely. The war left China shattered, impoverished, and on the brink of a civil war that would bring the communists to power in 1949. The range of the death toll estimate, 15 to 20 million, is huge. Why is it so difficult to get a more precise number for the Chinese casualties? How much of the historical record was deliberately destroyed or manipulated during the subsequent Chinese Civil War and its aftermath? And how would Western perceptions of the war change if the immense sacrifice of the Chinese people were as well known as the battles of Normandy or Stalingrad? Number 15, how did one nation build more tanks than its main enemy? On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The German army was the most powerful and experienced fighting force in the world. They expected a quick victory. They were wrong. One of the key reasons for their ultimate failure was the unexpected industrial might of the Soviet Union, particularly in one-area tank production. The Soviet Union produced approximately 105,000 tanks and self-propelled guns during the war. This is a staggering number, especially when compared to Germany, which produced around 46,000. How was this possible? Especially when the initial German invasion overran the Soviet Union's most valuable industrial and agricultural lands. The answer lies in 2 key factors: a brilliant tank design and an unprecedented industrial relocation. The tank was the T-34. When it first appeared on the battlefield in 1941, it came as a complete shock to the German soldiers. It had sloped armor that was highly effective at deflecting anti-tank rounds, a powerful 76.2mm gun, and wide tracks that allowed it to perform well in the mud and snow of the Eastern Front. Most importantly, it was simple. It was designed for mass production. It was not as technically sophisticated as the German Tiger or Panther tanks that would come later, but as the saying goes, quantity has a quality all its own. The Soviets could build them faster than the Germans could destroy them. Over 84,000 T-34s of all variants were built, making it the most produced tank of the war. The second factor was the incredible evacuation of Soviet industry. As the German army advanced, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy and the complete dismantling and relocation of vital war factories. Between July and November 1941, over 1,500 industrial enterprises were packed onto trains and moved hundreds or even thousands of miles east, beyond the Ural Mountains, out of the reach of German bombers. This was a logistical feat of incredible scale. Entire factories, along with their workers, were reassembled in places like Chelyabinsk, which became known as Tankograd Tank City. The conditions were horrendous. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, toiled in unheated buildings in the middle of the Siberian winter, often on starvation rations. But they produced. By 1943, the relocated Soviet factories were outproducing the entire German war economy in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. While Germany was building complex, over-engineered, and resource-intensive tanks like the Tiger I, of which only about 1,300 were made, the Soviets were churning out thousands of simple, effective T-34s. The German focus on quality over quantity proved to be a strategic mistake in a long war of attrition on the Eastern Front. And we have production numbers, but what was the human cost of the great industrial migration? How many Soviet workers died from exhaustion, accidents, or malnutrition while building the weapons that won the war? Could the German war effort have succeeded if their leadership had prioritized a simpler, mass-producible tank design like the Panzer IV instead of the complex big cats? And how much did Lend-Lease aid from the US, particularly in the form of high-quality steel and machine tools, contribute to the Soviets' ability to maintain this level of production? Number 14. How many people did the German regime systematically murder? Beyond the battlefield casualties and the victims of bombing, there was another, darker form of death during the war. This was the systematic, industrialized murder carried out by the German state and its collaborators against millions of people they deemed undesirable. The targets of this genocidal policy were diverse, but the largest group was Europe's Jewish population. The total number of people murdered in this state-sponsored campaign of extermination is estimated to be between 11 and 17 million. This number is not a combat statistic. These were not soldiers killed in action. They were men, women, and children, the vast majority of them civilians, who were systematically rounded up and killed. Approximately 6 million of those murdered were Jews. Before the war, about 9 million Jews lived in Europe. By 1945, 2 out of every 3 were dead. This was the result of a deliberate policy that evolved from persecution and ghettoization to mass shootings, and ultimately to the construction of dedicated extermination camps. In places like Poland and the Soviet Union, special mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the regular army and murdered over 1 million people, mostly by shooting them into mass graves. Later, the regime developed a more efficient method of killing. They built 6 major extermination camps in occupied Poland, including Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. People were transported to these camps by train from all over Europe, told they were being resettled, and then murdered in gas chambers. At the peak of its operation, the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex could murder and cremate thousands of people in a single day. But Jews were not the only victims. The German regime's ideology of racial purity and political control targeted many other groups. An estimated 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German custody, mostly from deliberate starvation, exposure, and neglect. This represents over 57% of all Soviet POWs captured. In contrast, the death rate for British and American POWs in German camps was less than 4%. The German authorities also targeted ethnic Poles, murdering between 1.8 and 2.7 million non-Jewish Polish civilians. Hundreds of thousands of Roma, often called gypsies, people with disabilities, political opponents, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses, were also victims of this system of persecution and murder. This was not a secret operation. It required the active participation of hundreds of thousands of people, bureaucrats to schedule the trains, soldiers to round up the victims, engineers to design the camps, and guards to run them. It was a bureaucratic and industrial process, documented in meticulous detail by its perpetrators, which is how we have come to know the horrifying scale of the crime. The numbers are based on German records, eyewitness accounts, and demographic studies. But what is the true final number of victims, including those from smaller, undocumented massacres? How many individuals who participated in these crimes at a low level were never brought to justice and simply blended back into society after the war? And what does it tell us about human nature that so many ordinary people could become complicit in such an extraordinary system of evil? Number 13, how many women joined the U.S. workforce? The war was not just fought on the battlefields, it was won in the factories, shipyards, and farms back home. With over 16 million Americans, mostly men, serving in the military, the country faced a massive labor shortage. The solution to this crisis fundamentally changed American society. Approximately 6 million women entered the American workforce during the war. This was a 57% increase in the number of working women. Before the war, the prevailing social norm was that a woman's place was in the home. Working women were often single or from lower income families. The war shattered this norm out of necessity. The government and industry launched a massive propaganda campaign to persuade women to take on jobs that had been traditionally considered men's work. The most famous symbol of this movement was Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who appeared on posters and in songs, flexing her muscle and representing the strong, capable female war worker. Women started building B-17 bombers, welding the hulls of Liberty ships, and producing munitions. They worked as electricians, mechanics, and machine operators. By 1944, women made up over 36% of the civilian labor force. The demographic of the female worker also changed. For the first time, large numbers of married, middle-class women went to work. This shift was not without its challenges. Women were often paid less than men for the same jobs, and they faced resistance and harassment in male-dominated workplaces. They also had to balance their new work responsibilities with their traditional roles of managing the household and caring for children. The government provided some funding for childcare centers, but the need far outstripped the supply. Many women relied on a network of family and friends to make it work. The impact of these Rosies was enormous. The productivity of the American economy during the war was miraculous. U.S. factories produced more war material than all the Axis powers combined. This industrial output was a decisive factor in the Allied victory, and it would not have been possible without the contribution of women. When the war ended, many women were pushed out of their jobs to make way for the returning veterans. But the door had been opened. The experience of working and earning a wage gave many women a new sense of independence and competence. The wartime experience is often seen by historians as a critical step toward the women's rights movements of the later 20th century. We know how many women entered the workforce, but how many experienced workplace accidents or long-term health problems from working with hazardous materials in unregulated wartime industries? What was the true psychological cost for the latchkey children, who were often left to fend for themselves while their mothers worked long shifts? And to what extent did the post-war pressure for women to return to domestic life contribute to the suburban conformity and social tensions of the 1950s? Number 12, how many American planes were built? In a 1940 speech, President Franklin D. Roosevelt laid out a challenge to American industry. He called for the production of 50,000 airplanes per year. At the time, the number seemed impossible. It was more than the total number of aircraft that existed in the entire world. But what American industry achieved would not only meet that goal, but shatter it. During the course of the war, from 1940 to 1945, the United States produced 297,000 aircraft. This is a number that is difficult to comprehend. It means that on average, a new plane was coming off an assembly line somewhere in America every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 5 years. This industrial feat was the result of a complete transformation of the American economy. Automobile factories were converted to build bombers. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, for example, was built specifically to produce B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. At its peak, it was producing one B-24 every hour. This was assembly line production applied to one of the most complex machines of the age. The variety of aircraft was immense. It included fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and back heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Superfortress transport planes, like the C-47 Skytrain, which carried paratroopers and supplies and naval aircraft, like the F-6F Hellcat, which dominated the skies over the Pacific. This flood of aircraft overwhelmed the Axis powers. Germany and Japan also had excellent aircraft designs and skilled pilots, but they could not compete with the sheer volume of American production. A skilled German pilot might shoot down several American planes, but for every one he destroyed, 10 more would arrive to take its place. The U.S. could afford to lose planes and crews at a rate that would have been unsustainable for its enemies. The arsenal of democracy was not just a slogan, it was a reality. The ability of the U.S. to produce on this scale was perhaps its single greatest contribution to the Allied victory. It was a war won not just by soldiers, but by the millions of workers on the home front who turned raw materials into an unstoppable air armada. We know the total number of planes produced, but what was the actual operational readiness rate? How many of these aircraft were lost, not in combat, but in training accidents or logistical mishaps on their way to the front? What was the true environmental cost of this massive, unregulated industrial production? A legacy of pollution that in some cases remains today. And how did the wartime government-industry partnership in aviation lay the groundwork for the military-industrial complex of the Cold War? Number 11. What was the civilian death toll in one country? The Soviet Union's contribution to the Allied victory was immense, and so was its price. The scale of suffering on the Eastern Front is almost beyond imagination. While the military casualties were horrific, the number of civilians who died is even more so. It is estimated that at least 14 million Soviet civilians were killed during the war. This number is a conservative estimate. Some historians put it closer to 20 million. This means that for every Soviet soldier who died, at least one, and perhaps more than one, civilian also perished. This is a ratio unlike that of any other major combatant nation. Why was the civilian death toll so high? It was a result of the unique and savage nature of the war on the Eastern Front. The German leadership viewed the conflict not just as a military campaign, but as a war of racial annihilation and ideological extermination. Their policies toward the Slavic populations of the Soviet Union were genocidal in intent. Millions of civilians died in the initial invasion. The German army's rapid advance trapped huge populations behind the lines. Millions more were killed in so-called anti-partisan operations, which were often just a pretext for the mass murder of entire villages. The German authorities deliberately engineered famines as a tool of policy. The Hunger Plan, a documented German strategy, called for seizing all available food supplies from the occupied territories to feed the German army and population, with the explicit understanding that this would lead to the starvation of millions of useless eaters. One of the most brutal examples of this was the siege of Leningrad. The city, now known as St. Petersburg, was surrounded by German and Finnish forces for 872 days from September 1941 to January 1944. All supply routes were cut off. The city was shelled and bombed relentlessly, but the biggest killer was starvation. Food rations were cut to near zero levels. People ate wallpaper paste, boiled leather, and eventually each other. During the siege, it is estimated that over 1 million civilians starved to death. In addition to those killed by direct violence and starvation, millions of Soviet civilians were rounded up and sent to Germany as forced laborers, where many died from overwork and abuse. And as we've seen, over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately killed in German custody. The war on the Eastern Front was a total war in the truest sense, a conflict where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant was erased, with catastrophic consequences for the people of the Soviet Union. The estimate of 14 to 20 million is a massive range. Given the chaos of the Eastern Front and the nature of the Soviet state, will we ever know the true number with any more certainty? How many of these civilian deaths were caused not by the invaders, but by the actions of the Soviet government itself, such as the internal deportations of ethnic groups or the ruthless tactics of its own security forces? And what are the deep, unhealed psychological scars that this unimaginable trauma left on the collective memory of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus? Number 10, how many people fought in the largest battle in history? The Eastern Front was a theater of superlatives, the largest armies, the most brutal fighting, and the highest casualties. It was here that the largest battle in human history took place, a clash of armies on a scale that is difficult to envision. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, is often cited for its ferocity. But an even larger engagement was the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. While Kursk involved the largest tank battle, if we look at the sheer number of personnel involved in a single, continuous military operation, the German invasion of the Soviet Union itself stands as the largest. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, involved nearly 4 million Axis soldiers. This was the largest invasion force ever assembled. They were organized into 3 massive army groups and supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. They attacked along an 1,800-mile front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Facing them was the Soviet Red Army. While caught by surprise and poorly led in the initial stages, the Soviet Union had a massive pool of manpower. Throughout the course of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the Soviets mobilized an estimated 34.5 million people. In the opening weeks of Barbarossa, the Red Army had approximately 3 million soldiers stationed on the western border to face the initial onslaught. So, in the opening phase of this gigantic campaign, you have roughly 7 million soldiers engaged in combat. But the battle did not stop there. It continued to rage for nearly 4 years. The conflict on the Eastern Front was a meat grinder. The Germans suffered an estimated 4 million killed, missing, or wounded. The Soviet military lost a staggering 8.7 million soldiers, according to official Russian figures, though many historians believe the true number is over 10 million. The scale of the individual battles within this larger conflict was also immense. At Stalingrad, over 2 million soldiers were involved on both sides. The battle consumed entire armies. The German Sixth Army, a force of nearly 300,000 men, was completely surrounded and annihilated. The fighting was so savage that the life expectancy for a newly arrived Soviet soldier in the city was less than 24 hours. The Battle of Kursk involved over 2 million troops and 6,000 tanks. These were not just battles, they were entire wars in and of themselves, involving more men and material than many other conflicts in history. The fighting on the Eastern Front was the decisive theater of the war in Europe. It was here that the German army was bled white, destroying the bulk of its manpower and equipment. The scale of the combat was simply unprecedented. We have the official order of battle documents, but what was the true number of irregular partisans and militia who fought and died, their contributions often going unrecorded? How many soldiers on the Eastern Front died not from enemy fire, but from the brutal weather, disease, or from their own side's disciplinary actions? And given the scale of the carnage, how many mass graves of soldiers from this conflict remain undiscovered across the vast plains of Eastern Europe? Yes, number 9. What was the daily death toll? The total death toll of the war is a number so large, around 75 million, that it can feel abstract. To bring the human cost into sharper focus, it is helpful to break it down. What did this sacrifice look like on a daily basis? The war lasted for 6 years and 1 day, or 2,194 days. If we divide the total estimated dead by the number of days, we arrive at a horrifying average. Over 34,000 people died every single day of the war. That is the equivalent of a small city being wiped off the map every 24 hours. For 6 years, this number, of course, is just an average. The killing was not evenly distributed. On some days, in some quiet sectors, the death toll was much lower. On other days, it was catastrophically higher. During the firebombing of Tokyo on March 10, 1945, around 100,000 people died in a single night. During the first day of the Battle of the Somme in World War I, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. While no single day of ground combat in World War II matched that level of concentrated slaughter for one army, the scale of the battles meant that days with casualties in the tens of thousands across all fronts were common. Consider the first day of Operation Barbarossa. The German Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured as German panzer divisions broke through their lines. Or, consider D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Allies suffered an estimated 10,000 casualties, including over 4,400 confirmed dead. But the daily toll was not just on the battlefields, it was in the besieged cities like Leningrad, where thousands starved to death each day at the height of the famine. It was in the extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the daily capacity for murder reached into the thousands. In the bombed cities of Germany, Britain, and Japan. And it was in the oceans where sailors on torpedoed merchant ships and warships drowned or died of exposure. The war created a constant global hum of death. Every minute, on average, about 24 people died. Before you can finish reading this paragraph, the equivalent of a classroom full of people would have perished. This relentless, daily attrition of human life is what makes the scale of the Second World War so difficult to truly comprehend. The daily average is a powerful statistic, but which specific day of the war saw the highest number of military deaths across all combined fronts? What was the quietest day of the war between September 1939 and August 1945? The day with the lowest recorded number of combat-related deaths? And how does our understanding of the war change when we stop thinking about it as a series of famous battles and start thinking of it as a continuous 6-year-long period of mass death? Number 8, how big was the D-Day invasion force? Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The logistics, planning, and sheer scale of the operation are mind-boggling even today. The success of D-Day June 6, 1944, was the beginning of the end for the German regime in Western Europe. On that single day, approximately 156,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy. This force was composed of American, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers. About 73,000 were American, 61,715 were British, and 21,400 were Canadian. They landed on 5 beaches with the codenames Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. In addition to the seaborne invasion, another 23,000 airborne troops were dropped behind enemy lines by parachute and glider to seize key bridges and road junctions. But the soldiers were only one part of the equation. The invasion required a massive naval armada to transport them across the English Channel and support them with gunfire. The D-Day fleet consisted of nearly 7,000 vessels. This included 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, and hundreds of ancillary and merchant ships. This fleet was a city on the water, stretching for miles across the channel, and above this fleet was an air force of unprecedented size. The Allies had achieved complete air supremacy over the invasion area. On D-Day, they flew over 14,000 sorties. More than 11,500 aircraft bombers, fighters, transports, and gliders supported the invasion. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was barely able to put a few dozen planes in the air to oppose them. The planning for this day was years in the making. It involved deception on a grand scale. Operation Fortitude, a complex campaign of misinformation, used fake armies, inflatable tanks, and double agents to convince the German high command that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the channel. The deception was so successful that even after the Normandy landings began, the German leadership held back crucial panzer divisions, believing Normandy was just a feint. The human cost of D-Day was high. The total Allied casualties for the day were around 10,000, with over 4,400 confirmed dead. The fighting on Omaha Beach was particularly savage, with the American forces there suffering over 2,000 casualties. But the foothold was secured. Within a week, over 326,000 troops had been landed. By the end of June, nearly 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in France. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. We have the official numbers of men and ships, but what was the true number of near failures and lucky breaks on D-Day that, had they gone the other way, could have caused the entire invasion to fail? How many German soldiers defending the beaches were not ethnic Germans, but conscripts from occupied Eastern European countries forced to fight for a regime they may have despised? And what critical intelligence secrets about the D-Day plans might still be classified in Allied archives? Number 7. How many Japanese Americans were interned? In the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a wave of fear and suspicion swept across the United States. This fear was directed primarily at one group of American citizens, those of Japanese ancestry. In one of the most shameful episodes in American history, the U.S. government forced them from their homes and into concentration camps. Of these, about 80,000, or 2/3, were Nisei second generation and Sansei third generation. This means they were native-born American citizens, they were not immigrants, they were Americans. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. While the language of the order was general, it was applied almost exclusively to Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. There was no evidence of widespread espionage or sabotage by this community. The decision was driven by what a later government commission called race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Families were given just days to sell or store their property, their homes, businesses, and farms, often at a catastrophic loss. They were allowed to take only what they could carry. They were first sent to temporary assembly centers, often hastily converted racetracks or fairgrounds, where they lived in horse stalls. From there, they were transported to one of 10 relocation centers, bleak, barbed wire enclosed camps located in remote and desolate parts of the country, such as Manzanar in the California desert and Heart Mountain in Wyoming. They lived in poorly constructed barracks with communal latrines and dining halls under the watch of armed guards. They lost their freedom, their property, and their dignity. Despite this, many Japanese Americans sought to prove their loyalty. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Nisei soldiers, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. They fought with incredible bravery in Europe, while their families were imprisoned back home. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the legality of the exclusion in the 1944 case, Korematsu versus United States, a decision that is now widely condemned as a legal and moral failure. The last camp was not closed until 1946. It was not until 1988 that the U.S. government formally apologized and paid reparations of $20,000 to each surviving internee. We know the total number of internees, but what was the full uncompensated economic loss suffered by the Japanese American community, a loss of property and opportunity that likely totaled billions in today's dollars? How many suicides, stress-related illnesses, and broken families were a direct result of the trauma of incarceration, statistics that are not captured in the official records? And what sensitive government documents from the era might reveal the true extent to which racial animus, rather than legitimate national security concerns, drove the decision-making process. Number 6. How many people died on the second day? The war began on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. But for Great Britain, the war at sea and the long and brutal Battle of the Atlantic began almost immediately. The first major British casualty was not a warship, but a civilian passenger liner. On September 3rd, 1939, just hours after Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30 torpedoed the SS Athenia. The ship was a British ocean liner carrying over 1,400 passengers and crew, sailing from Liverpool to Montreal. It was attacked without warning about 250 miles northwest of Ireland. 117 people were killed. Among the dead were more than 30 American citizens. The sinking caused an immediate international outcry. The German government, aware that attacking a passenger ship without warning was a violation of international law and could provoke the United States, immediately denied responsibility. They claimed that a British submarine must have sunk it, or that Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had ordered a bomb placed on the ship to create an incident that would bring America into the war. This was a lie. The commander of the U-30, Fritz Julius Lemp, had apparently mistaken the liner, which was sailing a zigzag course, for an armed merchant cruiser. The incident was a dark omen for what was to come. It demonstrated that the German submarine command was willing to wage unrestricted warfare from the very beginning. The Battle of the Atlantic would go on to be the longest campaign of the war, and it would claim the lives of over 30,000 Allied merchant mariners and 30,000 German U-boat crewmen. The sinking of the Athenia on the first day of Britain's war was the opening shot in this brutal conflict. The death toll of 117 seems small compared to the daily averages that would come later, but it was a profound shock at the time. These were civilians, including women and children, killed on the second day of the war. It shattered any illusion that the conflict might be limited to armies on the battlefield. It brought the reality of total war home to the public and set the stage for the 6 years of bloodshed that would follow. The official log of the U-30 was altered by the German Navy to hide their culpability. What other early war crimes or violations of international law were deliberately covered up by the combatant nations in the first chaotic months of the conflict? How did the deaths of American citizens on the Athenia secretly influence the Roosevelt administration's early, covert support for the Allied cause? And how many survivors of the sinking suffered lifelong psychological trauma that was never officially acknowledged or treated? Number 5. How many Poles died? Poland was the country where the war began, and it was a nation that suffered on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. It was caught between two ruthless totalitarian powers, Germany and the Soviet Union, both of which sought to destroy the Polish state and subjugate its people. Approximately 6 million Polish citizens were killed during the war. This represents about 17% of Poland's pre-war population. It is the highest per capita death toll of any country in the war. This staggering number includes casualties from all causes military action, German extermination policies, Soviet repression, and the secondary effects of the brutal occupation. The military campaign in September 1939 was swift and brutal. The Polish army was defeated in a matter of weeks by the combined invasion of Germany from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. But the military deaths were only a small fraction of the total. The vast majority of the dead were civilians. The German occupation of Poland was exceptionally cruel. The German leadership's plan was to destroy Polish culture, eliminate its intellectual and political elites, and turn the remaining population into a slave labor force. Mass executions, deportations, and the systematic looting of the country or standard policy. Half of the 6 million Polish citizens killed were Polish Jews, murdered as part of the German regime's genocidal plan to exterminate the Jewish people of Europe. The major extermination camps, including Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka, were built on Polish soil. The other 3 million victims were mostly ethnic Poles. They were killed in massacres, died in concentration camps, or perished from the brutal conditions of the occupation. In 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals in what became known as the Katyn Forest Massacre. In 1944, the city of Warsaw rose up against the German occupiers in a heroic but doomed rebellion. The Warsaw Uprising lasted for 63 days. The German response was to systematically level the city block by block. An estimated 150,000 to 200,000 civilians were killed. At the end of the war, Poland was in ruins. Its capital was a field of rubble. A fifth of its population was dead. Its pre-war borders had been shifted dramatically westward, forcing the migration of millions of people. And its liberation by the Soviet Red Army simply meant the replacement of one form of foreign domination with another, which would last for the next 45 years. Poland's story is one of the most tragic of the entire war. What is the true number of Polish citizens who were deported to the Soviet Gulag, and how many of them never returned? How much of Poland's cultural heritage, art, books, and archives was systematically looted or destroyed by both occupying powers, and how much of it remains lost forever? And what are the untold stories of the Polish righteous among the nations, the non-Jewish Poles who risked their lives to save Jews, a number that is the highest of any nation, but is still likely an undercount? Number 4. How many Soviet POWs died in captivity? The fate of prisoners of war varied dramatically depending on who captured them and what nationality they were. For Soviet soldiers who fell into German hands, captivity was often a death sentence. The treatment of Soviet POWs by the German regime represents one of the greatest and yet least known crimes of the war. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German custody. This is an almost unbelievable number. It represents 57.5% of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured. This death rate is without parallel. By comparison, about 3.6% of British and American POWs died in German captivity. This was not an accident of war. It was the result of a deliberate policy of extermination through neglect. The German leadership considered Soviet soldiers to be subhuman, ideological, and racial enemies. The Geneva Conventions, which set standards for the treatment of prisoners, were completely disregarded. In the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, the German army encircled and captured millions of Red Army soldiers. They were completely unprepared and unwilling to care for such vast numbers of prisoners. The POWs were marched for days without food or water. They were held in open-air enclosures exposed to the brutal Russian winter with no shelter. Starvation was rampant. The official rations for Soviet POWs were set at a level that guaranteed death. Disease, particularly typhus and dysentery, swept through the crowded, unsanitary camps. Beyond deliberate starvation, there was also direct killing. Tens of thousands of Soviet POWs, particularly political commissars, Jews, and Asians, were singled out and executed by the SS and security police. Later in the war, some Soviet POWs were used for medical experiments or were simply worked to death as slave laborers. The scale of the dying was so great that it actually began to harm the German war effort. By 1942, with a growing labor shortage in Germany, some military leaders argued for better treatment of the POWs so they could be used as a source of labor. The conditions did improve slightly for the survivors, but by then, millions were already dead. This event stands as a stark example of how the ideological nature of the war on the Eastern Front led to atrocities on a scale that dwarfed the fighting in the West. We have German records that give us the horrifying total, but how many Soviet POWs were killed by their own side, executed by NKVD, blocking detachments for attempting to surrender? What was the fate of the Soviet POWs who survived German captivity and were repatriated to the Soviet Union, where Stalin's regime often treated them as traitors and sent them to the Gulag? And what personal diaries or letters from these prisoners might still exist, undiscovered in archives, that could tell the human story behind the statistics of this mass death? Number 3, how much shipping was sunk in the Atlantic? The Battle of the Atlantic was the war's longest and arguably most decisive campaign. If Britain had been starved into submission, an invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The entire war hinged on keeping the sea lanes open. The cost of doing so was measured in sunken ships and drowned men. Over the course of the battle, German U-boats and other naval and air forces sank approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships. This amounts to a staggering 14.5 million gross tons of shipping. To put that in perspective, that is the equivalent of sending more than 70 of the world's largest modern cruise ships to the bottom of the ocean. And in addition to the merchant vessels, 175 Allied warships were also sunk while defending the convoys. The losses were particularly heavy in the early years of the war, the happy time for the U-boat crews. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of shipping. It was a time when it seemed the U-boats might actually win the battle. They sank ships faster than the Allies could replace them. The waters off the American East Coast became a U-boat hunting ground, known as Torpedo Alley. The human cost was immense. Over 30,000 Allied merchant mariners lost their lives. These were civilian sailors, men from dozens of different countries who faced the daily threat of a torpedo strike. Their job was one of the most dangerous of the war. When a ship went down, especially a tanker carrying flammable fuel, the chances of survival were slim. The cold waters of the North Atlantic would kill a man in minutes. The tide turned in May 1943. A combination of factors gave the Allies the upper hand. Better intelligence from code breaking, the use of long-range patrol aircraft, improved radar technology, and new anti-submarine weapons allowed the Allies to hunt the U-boats more effectively. In that 1 month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, a catastrophic loss for the German submarine force. Admiral Donitz was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic. While the battle would continue until the last day of the war, the U-boat threat was never again as severe. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was a victory of production, technology, and endurance. The ability of American and British shipyards to build Liberty ships and other vessels faster than the Germans could sink them was a crucial factor. But it was a victory bought at a terrible price, paid by the civilian sailors who crewed the vital convoys. We know how many ships were sunk, but how many sailors listed as missing, presumed drowned, were actually machine gunned in the water by U-boat crews, a war crime that was difficult to document. What is the total environmental impact of the millions of tons of oil and hazardous materials that went to the bottom of the ocean in these wrecks? And how many of these thousands of shipwrecks, a vast underwater museum of the war, have never been located? Number 2. What was the total military death toll? Behind all the strategies, battles, and technologies of the war lies a simple, brutal fact: the purpose of an army in wartime is to kill the soldiers of the other army. The military death toll of the Second World War is a testament to the efficiency with which the combatant nations carried out this grim task. It is estimated that between 20 and 25 million soldiers were killed in the war. This number includes those killed in action, those who died of their wounds, those who died as prisoners of war, and those who were listed as missing and never found. The number is so large because the armies involved were the biggest the world had ever seen, and the weapons they used were more lethal than ever before. The distribution of these deaths was wildly uneven, reflecting the nature of the different fronts. The Soviet Union suffered the most catastrophic military losses. The official figure, declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union, is 8.7 million military dead. Many Western historians, like Richard Overy, believe the true figure is likely higher, perhaps as many as 11 million. This means that the Red Army alone accounted for nearly half of all military deaths in the entire war. Germany suffered the second highest losses with an estimated 5.3 million military dead. The vast majority of these casualties, about 4 out of 5, occurred on the Eastern Front fighting the Red Army. The war for Germany was won or lost in the East. China's military losses are difficult to calculate precisely due to poor record keeping and the chaos of the war, but they are estimated to be between 3 and 4 million. Japan lost approximately 2.1 million military personnel. The United States, which entered the war late and had a large industrial and population base, suffered about 416,800 military deaths. The United Kingdom lost around 383,000. These numbers tell a story. They show that the war was, for the most part, a gigantic land war fought on the Eurasian continent. The battles on the Eastern Front and in China were wars of attrition on a scale that dwarfed the fighting in Western Europe, North Africa, or the Pacific Islands. For every one American soldier killed, the Soviet Union lost more than 20. This disparity in sacrifice is a crucial and often overlooked aspect of the Allied victory. The official numbers are staggering, but how many soldiers were killed by friendly fire? A statistic that all militaries have historically been reluctant to track or publicize. What is the true number of desertions and suicides among the armies of the major combatants, figures that are often hidden in the broader category of non-combat deaths? And how many of the millions listed as missing in action were not killed, but simply walked away from the war and started new lives under new identities? Number one, what was the final human cost? This is the most fundamental and most horrifying statistic of all. When you add up the soldiers and the civilians, the victims of bombs and the victims of bullets, the victims of deliberate policy, and the victims of disease and starvation, what is the final number? The most commonly accepted estimate for the total number of people killed in World War II is 75 million. Some estimates range as low as 60 million, others as high as 85 million. The exact number will never be known. But the general scale is clear. The war killed about 3% of the entire world's population in 1940. The most shocking aspect of this number is the ratio of civilians to soldiers. In World War I, about 10% of the dead were civilians. In World War II, that figure flipped. Civilians accounted for roughly 2/3 of all deaths. An estimated 55 million non-combatants were killed. This was a war where the front line was everywhere, in the city, in the village, in the home. The distinction between soldier and civilian, a concept that had been central to the laws of war for centuries, was effectively erased. The geographic distribution of death was also heavily skewed. The war was global, but the dying was concentrated. The Soviet Union and China together accounted for more than half of all deaths. Poland lost a higher percentage of its population than any other country. Germany and Japan, the primary Axis powers, also suffered immense losses, both military and civilian. In contrast, the Western Allies, like the United States and the United Kingdom, suffered far fewer casualties relative to their population. The number 75 million is a statistic, but it represents 75 million individual lives. Each one was a person with a family, with hopes, with a future that was cut short. It was a factory worker in Coventry, a farmer in Ukraine, a soldier on a Pacific island, a child in the Warsaw Ghetto, a sailor in the North Atlantic. The sheer scale of the loss is what makes World War II the deadliest conflict in human history. It is a number that serves as a permanent warning of the human capacity for destruction. Given the destruction of records and the chaos of the post-war world, will we ever be able to narrow the 25 million person gap in the estimates of the total dead? How many people died in the first few years after the war from war-related causes such as famine, disease, or wounds, whose deaths are not included in the standard totals? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, with the growth of world population and the development of even more destructive weapons, what would the death toll of a third world war look like?